For over 41 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine. Today, we'll examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Repke, and this is Build Situation Room. We start again with images from yesterday. Russia directed 5 kamikaze drones into a residential building in Kharkiv, a city home to 1 million people. Here we see a surveillance camera that captured the exact moment of these impacts. And we also see how this house was gradually destroyed by these drones in the initial strikes. We still had, so to speak, a functioning structure. Now we can see that part of the facade of this residential building has collapsed. And due to these massive deliberate attacks on a single residential block, there were a total of 7 fatalities and over 20 injured. And we'll see shortly among the dead, we don't see it now, but the images we viewed yesterday showed it clearly. Among the dead was a 1.5-year-old child who was carried from the rubble, and a 16-year-old boy was also among them. We now see here one of the first eyewitnesses looking at this residence from a certain direction. We also see this structural failure of the house, which we have already seen in the other footage. That means the roof has collapsed here, but we're really only seeing one single particular perspective of it. The house was struck in several different locations, and that's what caused the fire to break out, which unfortunately led to the deaths and injuries of many people in the surrounding area. Once again, it's clearly evident that Russia isn't just targeting military sites, but also repeatedly aiming at civilians. Tonight, there were new attacks on Kremenchuk, and here you can see a father carrying his child out of the rubble, desperate and heartbroken. And in Kremenchuk, there were also attacks on civilian infrastructure, on electronic infrastructure, right after the summit in Washington, which was supposed to bring peace. And in the process, a power plant was hit, among other things, leaving 1,500 households without electricity. We're moving straight to the combat action in the east of the country, first wanting to take a closer look at Ukraine's ongoing efforts there, north of Pokrovsk, to push back the Russian offensive in that area. We recall, just before the summit in Alaska, Putin had initiated this offensive to exert significant pressure on Ukraine, essentially sending them a clear message: you're going to lose anyway, I'm going to advance with everything I've got, so you might as well give us the Donbass voluntarily. We're examining the new footage that clearly demonstrates how Ukraine proceeded in a very systematic and deliberate way. First, they employed grenade launchers to strike the villages occupied by Russia here, particularly the village of Kucherivka, one of approximately 10 to 12 villages that was swiftly captured just north of Pokrovsk during this rapid offensive by the Russian army. We are now seeing the impacts, of course, not in civilian areas, but rather where the Russians have been hiding in this forest ridge. At least 6 villages were able to be recaptured by then. However, this means, as we can immediately see on the map, some of them are still under Russian control. After the grenade launchers were deployed and the initial substantial losses were caused, particularly among the Russian infantry forces, the tanks then proceeded to move forward into the specified zone. We're now seeing another video from the Ukrainian army. A tank brigade has most likely deployed 2 T-64s to the area around Hrutska, another village that had just been occupied, and we can now see quite clearly there are 2 tanks working in tandem together. A T-64 here and another T-64 here, which are alternating their fire and seem to have relatively good information about where the Russians are hiding, especially in this wooded area next to the village of Hutska. And the interesting thing, which we can see in these recordings and which we already mentioned a week ago, was that the Ukraine's chance to push back lay primarily in the fact that the Russians couldn't keep up with their drones. That means the infantry advanced too far, up to 18 kilometers, so that the Russian elite drone units with their fiber optic guided drones couldn't deploy effectively here. Which is why the Ukrainian tanks were then able to hunt relatively undisturbed for individual Russian soldiers here without being attacked in the process. The whole thing was a very risky move by Putin, because he tried to really create facts ahead of the summit to increase the pressure significantly, and of course before the Washington summit, which we clearly observed yesterday, but the entire plan went completely awry, as evident in the latest video. We had a very short sequence of it yesterday, but today we have more. After partly cutting off the Russians here, after hitting them with GMLRS rockets, we also observed robots being deployed yesterday. Mobile robots equipped with machine guns and tanks, and then the Ukrainians stormed in, systematically clearing out the houses that had been occupied by the Russian forces. Now they've cleared the area and taken prisoners. That's crucial. Unlike the Russians, they take prisoners, as we saw yesterday in that 1 second. But now we're seeing here, it's actually quite a number of prisoners. Here we see them lying on the ground who have been captured. We have overall information from various Ukrainian units that approximately 24 Russians were captured. Here is additional footage that has been released, providing further details on the situation. However, it is also reported that the number of Russian dead exceeds 270 in this offensive that was carried out here. And the captured Russians in turn stated that an entire brigade, meaning over 3,000 men, were deployed into these so-called hare ears. Let's take a closer look at it again. because it was so crucial for the Kremlin to dare this advance northward. We see that the whole thing ended in disaster. However, a part of it is still under Russian occupation. We'll take another look at it on the map, as I mentioned. For the Russians, this road up here was key. I'll sketch it out quickly. This road from Dobry Pilya, which goes all the way to Slovyansk to Kramatorsk. Soloti Kolodja, that was the largest village that was captured here, but also the 10 other villages, roughly 10 villages in this region. And this is how it appeared as recently as August 13th. Over time, parts of the area were, as we'll see shortly, gradually recaptured by the Ukrainian military forces. So that means the road is open again, Soloti Kolodja is clear again, but we have more Russian units moving in this area. And indeed, one of the surprises, you might almost say, of the Ukrainians, who initially assumed these were small infiltration units or isolated sabotage teams, a surprise the Ukrainians experienced was not dozens, but rather over 1,000, some even say up to 3,000 Russians who advanced on foot, motorcycles or all-terrain vehicles into this region. And because of this, the fighting continues, even though Ukraine has, for its part, mobilized and deployed various units of the National Guard, paratroopers, and other specialized forces to this critical area. That means we still have heavy fighting in the region. However, the objective that the Russians had to cut off Kramatorsk and Slovyansk and to create facts on the ground, this objective clearly did not come to fruition. We also saw it in the double city of Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad in the southern part. The front remains highly threatened by the Russians, who are determined to establish clear facts here. And here we have a new video showing us how the Russian army is attacking Myrnohrad. Myrnohrad, once a major city, is clearly visible here with its high-rise districts shown. Or rather, a larger city with over 40,000 inhabitants. And what's particularly interesting is how far off some of the bombs end up landing. Apparently, the cameraman operating the drone here, who essentially just provided the coordinates for the attack, is entirely focused on this specific high-rise district area. But what we're about to see is here at the upper left corner. We'll see it in a moment, and the cameraman will notice it too. Here is where the explosions are happening, hundreds of meters, probably even a kilometer away from where one actually thought. Well, there are now some bomb impacts here, so to speak. And we're about to witness more, most likely FAB 500 bombs striking the area. This time, at least somewhere near where you'd expect. But once again, you might notice this cross here, which is clearly visible, and the impacts are really spread out quite a bit further apart. Nonetheless, it's once again quantity over quality. That means the Russians are simply firing hundreds of bombs instead of a few. And eventually, through the sheer carpet bombing, so to speak, you're bound to hit your targets here, no matter what happens. So Myrnohrad, which remains securely under the control of the Ukrainian army, we observed roughly 2 weeks ago that small units of Russian soldiers had managed to advance toward Pokrovsk. There as well, the Ukrainian army reported yesterday that all Russians in Pokrovsk have been eliminated. The city is once again completely under Ukrainian control. That means the Russians are still trying, both to take the twin cities of Myrnohrad-Pokrovsk as well as north of there, the two major cities, and I mean real major cities with a combined population of over 500,000, to separate Slovyansk and Kramatorsk from the rest of Ukraine. We want to take a look at a very peculiar propaganda video that the Russian state broadcaster Russia Today released yesterday. Specifically, a video of a vehicle from the Russian military which was deployed here with both the Russian and US flags prominently shown in the footage. The video was released just before the summit began to clearly show they were now effectively aligned with the United States' stance. After tonight, Putin and his state propaganda won't think that anymore. Nevertheless, this video was shown, and interestingly enough, it's about a previously captured by the Russians, a M113, an armored personnel carrier originally produced in the US, supplied to Ukraine, later seized by the Russians, and now actively deployed in Malotokmachka, a small village located in the Zaporizhzhia region in the southern part of Ukraine, to push forward in this area. Now we see it once more here before it zooms out, the same M113 again, essentially driving to the left, and it has both the US flag and the Russian flag displayed on it. Interestingly, and in that sense, it's another video that probably doesn't fully serve the propaganda purpose. Interestingly, it's now being hit one after another by several Ukrainian drones. New explosions keep happening. Already you can see fuel being carried here after the first drone hit. And more hits follow right away. Now a fire is starting to break out here. Here's another drone hit. Nonetheless, the Russians keep going, somehow wanting to show how many 100 meters or kilometers you can rush towards the front with such a vehicle before it was completely destroyed. And we'll see right away that it was filmed in a kind of time-lapse, and in the end the video concludes right in the middle of a muddy mess. We're seeing it here now. The vehicle just ends up here on the street. It didn't fulfill any mission at all, and most likely, I can only speculate, but most likely there's a massive drone strike shortly after. Then the whole thing explodes, and then it's no longer useful for propaganda because the vehicle gets destroyed. As I said, it's an interesting move by Russian state propaganda, which exclusively released this video yesterday just to show the US and we are now on the same side. Of course, that's nonsense, but the Russians at least had their propaganda stunt, which completely dissolves into thin air as soon as you watch the entire video in its entirety. From armored personnel carriers, we move on to the topic of drones, aiming to explore how both sides are increasingly deploying fiber optic drones. We first observe Ukrainian units once again actively hunting Russian forces in the Kreminna region here. Interestingly, targeting Russian logistics here as well. The Russians have managed to set up quite a few nets over the roads by now, but the Ukrainians actually have a pretty solid understanding of where the side roads are, essentially pinpointing the gaps in these nets and identifying where they can launch strikes with the fiberglass drones. We can see here that a Russian in the very last moment is actually seeking safety and driving the car into the bushes. We're about to see that there's quite a lot of traffic here, especially on the left side. I hope you can see this. Here, a Russian is already driving away from the drone, and barely visible, another Russian vehicle is standing, which is now being directly targeted by the drone. Here we are also seeing further attacks in the forest all around Kreminna, and this is all logistics. It's probably a desert cross that we just saw. Here is a converted Bachanka bus constantly spotted either between dense trees or under these nets, but all of this is helping the Russians relatively little. That here a GATS UAZ is being attacked. So many military vehicles though, and this is also very important, not classic infantry fighting vehicles and armored vehicles, but rather military vehicles, but primarily off-road vehicles, which are being targeted here by the fiber optic drones. Let's also take a brief moment to examine that on the map, because Kreminna, which we repeatedly see in these recordings, is absolutely critical for the Russian army to advance further, to push ahead further north within this so-called Ukrainian defensive belt, stretching across Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Druzhkivka and Kostiantynivka, and to ultimately seize control of Lyman. Lyman is the major objective of the Russians in the north of the Donetsk front. Between them lie these two villages, Torske and Zarikne. Torske is mostly Russian-controlled, with battles still ongoing. But everything we've just witnessed were attacks in this particular area. That means on the western outskirts of Kreminna, where the expansive Serebryansk forest begins, the Russians have the capability to efficiently utilize this dense woodland to supply and reinforce their front lines effectively. And the Ukrainians, as we can clearly observe, have the capability. What is that approximately? To traverse this relatively extensive distance of 20 kilometers by utilizing the fiber optic drones effectively. We also notice that they frequently wait in position until the Russian vehicles arrive, and then they meticulously prepare the ambush to severely disrupt the logistics operations in Kreminna. However, the same ambush tactic with the fiberglass drones is also used by the Russian army. We're now taking a closer look at some new footage from Novopavlivka, located in the Dnipro region. The Ukrainians keep trying to hold the front along the oblast border, and now we're witnessing an ambush by the Russian army. We'll see it shortly. The drone, or we've just spotted it, the drone equipped with the warhead up there has just taken off and is now targeting the first Ukrainian vehicle, right on a very narrow road. It's an MRAP. And now we're also seeing, interestingly enough, once again how this vehicle wasn't destroyed by just a single drone or the lone. RPG warhead here, but new drones keep being deployed repeatedly. For the first time, there's minor damage visible. Some kind of fluid has leaked out, but so far we don't see any fire yet. That means the Russians have to keep deploying drone after drone to repeatedly attack that vehicle positioned over there. They clearly have the necessary resources, and that's worth noting, and by now it's most likely nighttime. We're seeing thermal images now, quite clear, and it's the same vehicle again, the one from earlier, which from a Russian view, in quotes, finally caught fire. It continues here. This is the vehicle we saw earlier, the one that was targeted and attacked. And here's a new Ukrainian vehicle, probably a Humvee, driving along or conducting an evacuation, and now it's also being attacked by the Russians, all on the same road and within the same few meters. So we can see just how many drones are needed for a single ambush to be effective here. What we're seeing now are other clips from the same region, but interestingly, two separate attacks on Ukrainian army robots. So here we see a Ukrainian supply robot that has just come to a halt here or driven up to this precise spot and hasn't moved forward since that exact moment. And we can see all these wheels, we see the storage area in the center, and of course the possibility to move forward on the left and right sides. These robots are also being used more and more frequently by Ukraine, also by Russia, but especially by Ukraine, with a lot of Western-supported equipment, and they are now being attacked by the Russians. The good thing here, of course, is that when they launch another attack on the robot, these robots are absolutely ideal for the Ukrainian army because they don't have to sacrifice soldiers to carry out the logistics. And yes, of course, they cost money, and yes, of course, the Russians can attack them too, but it doesn't endanger the lives of Ukrainian soldiers. One last video we want to take a look at, and that is Ukraine has introduced a new cruise missile. The cruise missile with the very rosy name Flamingo was tested here for the first time. Here we see one of the tests sourced from zn.ua, which refers to Ukrainian media. We've taken over this video, which was also published exclusively for our use. And we see that the cruise missile has now been deployed. There are several test flights currently being carried out. Supposedly, it should have a range of around 3,000 kilometers. So that would be roughly about 6 times as far as, for example, the German Taurus. It's said to have a warhead weighing 1 ton, if that's accurate, and supposedly will go into mass production starting next year. Still, these are the first attempts made public to show some confidence. And in that sense, it's obviously not entirely clear yet whether it's actually ready for mass production at this point. We just heard it, probably not for a few months. In any case, the Ukrainians are already making attempts to use it now, carrying out some tests and aiming to deploy it as soon as possible against the Russians. Because at the moment, it's only the Russian side that possesses long-range cruise missiles and ballistic weaponry. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, only have, quote-unquote, their drones. As a result, it's absolutely crucial for the Ukrainians to catch up on cruise missiles. However, one last thing on that, there is some criticism. They say it's probably a very basic and quite straightforward approach. A slow-moving target traveling at roughly 800 kilometers per hour. The Russians are highly effective at shooting down such targets, but they face considerable difficulties with smaller drones like the Luti. In that regard, it remains to be seen how efficient the whole thing will be. In any case, it is certainly important for the Ukrainian army to have another tool to hit the Russians deep within their own territory.